Hello and welcome back to the Do More Foundation podcast. This is the Roaming Mic series. We're so excited to have a microphone traveling the country, finding experts and innovators doing best practice and all kinds of interesting work in their development field. Today we have Tess Peacock from the Equality Collective. Thanks for joining me, Tess, on this episode.
Oh, Jess, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. It's really great to engage and take time and take stock to unpack learnings. And it's a pleasure to be here with such an amazing partner, the Do More Foundation. So thank you very much.
Amazing. So today's podcast is all around the power of advocacy in ECD. And before we get into the meaty stuff, we always start, if you've ever met a Do More Foundation team member, you'll know we really love to play. And so it would not be a Do More podcast if I didn't ask you a fun question to start our time off together. So we know in the field of advocacy, not every day is a win. There's a lot of low moments. And so my question to you, which you can answer at the end, is what is your go-to tune when you're just having one of those days and you're just needing something to pick you up? I'd love to hear you sing your song for us today.
So, have one, sure.
We're leaping into talking about advocacy, and I think it would be really helpful for the listeners and the viewers online to hear who you are and where you come from, and perhaps how you came to be in the advocacy space.
Okay, fantastic. My name is Tess Peacock. I'm the director of the Equality Collective. We are a community-based lawyering organization based in the deep rural central wild coast of the Eastern Cape. We're an organization deeply committed to sitting at the nexus of grassroots organizing and mobilization, but also influencing policy and law at a kind of provincial and national level. So we're kind of interesting in that we sit at this nexus. But that's who we are.
And what is your background? Like, where did advocacy first kind of catch your heart and passion?
Sure. I grew up in an activist household. My mom was an anti-apartheid struggle human. I kind of grew up in Kasatu. She was a unionist. And my dad was also a lefty and an activist as well. So that's kind of, I was sort of bred this way. But my history is one of both kind of benefiting from the privilege of growing up with my family in terms of white privilege in South Africa, but also having historical persecution as a Jewish South African. And so I guess the both of those histories are ones that I kind of really embody in my soul in terms of how can I, with all the skills that I have and the privilege that I have as a South African, commit to being kind of useful in driving this country towards a more equal country and really embodying the constitutional values and promises of the Constitution. So I think my first personal march was the Treatment Action Campaign march when I was still at school, and really galvanized in what it means to hold government accountable and what does the promise of the Constitution actually mean. And so as a young teenager, I was kind of emboldened into activism as well. And then kind of, I guess really have taken that path as a serious part of how I want to be in the world in building responsive and accountable governance.
I mean, I really applaud you for so many of those moments where you choose to be active versus inactive. I think there's this tendency in pockets of society to shy away from politics, and it sounds like that was just not on the cards for you and your family.
No, definitely not on the cards. And also more than that, it's about like being a change agent, really kind of deliberately trying to make the world better, and not just talking about it. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to make the world better? And particularly in South Africa, we're the most unequal country in the world. And so what does it mean to hold that? What is our responsibility? And I think, I do kind of embody those principles. And for me, that's really about in terms of like a theory of change, one can have choices to sit in government or sit in elite circles or whatever. And I think for me, what's so important is to be grounded and rooted in communities and in relationship. And I think that's how we actually build power and build change. It's very seductive to want to go sit in national government or to go and sit at in particular echelons of power, I guess. But when we really want to see change happening at the local level, I really strongly believe that we've got to be building power in our communities. And really trying problem solving at the kind of grassroots level and not sitting too remotely from the challenges that people are actually facing.
Sure. And I guess to your point around this nexus of being based somewhere where you can have this hands-on experience and really engage meaningfully with the community while also using the law as a strategic tool for change. I would love to hear a little bit about your ECD focus here, because in some ways we've started off really broad, and I'm glad we've done that, because in many ways I think people wonder how advocacy campaigns are born. And I guess the question is, why ECD, and how have you used law as a strategic tool for ECD advocacy?
So I think when I came into the ECD sector, I came in as an activist with a lawyer mind frame, and I kind of entered the sector around 2017, and was really just totally like onboarded in terms of how important early childhood development is, how important the first 1,000 days are, but the 0 to 6 track is, and just how instrumental it is that if we get that right, you're talking about a massive injection in terms of growth and possibly changing people's trajectories in terms of their lives, but really meeting the values of the Constitution around equality and poverty reduction. And so I was totally sold. And then it became, we did there was a children's amendment bill that was tabled before Parliament, and the sector was saying this doesn't meet our needs, it doesn't address our challenges. And I guess in that moment I was galvanized to use the advocacy skills that I'd worked in other sectors. I'd worked in for equal education on their national council and movement building. I'd worked in the human rights law firm spaces. I'd worked in advocacy as a student. And so trying to use all those different skills that I'd gained in other sectors and applying it to the ECD space, which I think at that time wasn't as organized and wasn't really doing a lot of advocacy work. There was a lot of service delivery related work and kind of technical pieces being put out, but there wasn't a lot of strategic advocacy, and maybe in small pockets, but certainly not at a coalition level. And basically we saw a gap, and we thought this is actually what the sector needs, to have a kind of much more focused advocacy agenda for long-term systemic change. And it looked like that was a gap that needed to be filled. And that was around 2020. That we kind of came into the ECD sector.
Yeah, I mean, again, you bring up 2020. That was a crazy year of COVID-19, and the political kind of environment was uncertain, because the environment we were living in on the ground was uncertain. But I think it birthed a lot of connection on the ground that wasn't there before, because all of a sudden we were all fighting this COVID thing that no one really understood, but there were also very real industries that were impacted by the decisions made at that time. So, yeah, I mean, just as you speak about it, I relive those thoughts. What do you think are some of the big systemic barriers that are facing young children? And the Do More Foundation, the Equality Collective, representing young children, you're coming across these issues all the time. What would you put on the table as the big systemic kind of bottlenecks that we're dealing with?
So I think there's a dual challenge. There's a dual challenge of the 1.3 million children who are currently unreached and aren't accessing any form of ECD program, kind of from 3 to 5. And there's the challenge of children who are being reached but are in unregistered centres and aren't necessarily getting the quality that they should be getting and aren't getting government support that they should be getting. So we've almost got this kind of dual challenge. And I think related to that is we've got massive funding gaps. The proportion of the budget that goes to ECD versus basic education is absolutely minuscule. So that's major funding gaps. There's state duty gaps. The way that the law sees ECD is just to regulate non-state actors or private providers. There's no obligation on the state to actually provide or to actually support or to actually fund. The funding, the legal mechanism and the legislation to fund is discretionary. And the registration requirements are exclusionary. They envisage highly resourced kind of providers. And then on top of that, we lack government coordination, because remember, early childhood development isn't just early learning. You're talking about nutrition, maternal and child healthcare, parental caregiving support, responsive caregiving, etc. And so what we need is strong coordination. And unfortunately, our government has shown that coordination across departments, just in almost every issue, is an area that kind of is wanting. So we won't be able to get universal access to ECD unless we properly recognize ECD as a public good, as a right, where there are clear state obligations to ensure we can actually achieve universal access, and that the money follows those dreams.
Absolutely.
That you actually properly fund this. Yeah.
There was never a more pertinent time to say these words than the week of the budget speech, right? So we're sitting here in this current scenario for those that are listening, when we see this happening, and if there aren't voices being amplified around ECD, we're going to lose the traction around gaining access to the funds that are being put on the table. So just a glimpse into the here and now. I have a question for you around organizations that have an interest in advocacy. And the reason that I ask is because so many nonprofits, as you say, are involved in pockets of advocacy, sometimes small kind of service delivery issues, or maybe petitions. That's a really prominent kind of space that people get involved in. You know, there's a protest every now and again. What would you say to an organization wanting to get involved in more higher level advocacy?
So I just want to take a step back. So 4 years ago in 2020, ECD was barely spoken about, and we've actually mapped in the media trends. And then you get 2020, the founding of Real Reform for ECD, that spikes dramatically. And in 2024, you're talking about it increased exponentially. So between 2017 and 2024, you've seen a massive shift in the public discourse on early childhood development. And I think a lot of that is because of advocacy. And so it's so critical to have a long-term systemic view of advocacy, because it means that you can shift attention and political prioritizing, which we've seen now in the budget. We're in budget week. We've got the biggest moment in South Africa's history of a change in political will, where the state is actually considering putting its money where we say the priorities are most important. And I think a lot of that is because of advocacy. And the way we've done this advocacy for Real Reform for ECD is not to set up a separate advocacy organization and make advocacy seem inaccessible to organizations, who typically do service delivery work. What we've tried to say is embed this in your work, add it as a work stream, figure out how to embed it. It's not an either or. We absolutely need service delivery, right? It's not an alternative to service delivery. But what we need is active and informed citizens to make that kind of service delivery sustainable and scalable. And so embed that in your work. And our local government campaign is one of the best ways in which to do that, because a lot of your service delivery bread and butter issues at the ECD level is going to hit up against registration issues, local government issues, fees, etc. And so part of it is saying, how do I become an active citizen in my life and in the work that I do? And so overlay advocacy on your work. I wouldn't necessarily say shift, I would say embed, embed it in the way that you work and build a culture of active citizenry in the way that you do kind of service delivery work. And sometimes it can feel daunting, but it shouldn't feel daunting,
Yes. I mean, I guess in the same way that the ECD practitioner is championing in her community, she's advocating for those children in a number of different ways as part of her everyday. So we're, in some ways, you're saying a very similar thing. It's actually, the onus is on each of us to embed that into the role. And as organizations proudly representing real reform today, it's been wonderful for Do More to kind of walk that journey. And I thought I'd share that with you on the podcast so that our listeners can hear that it's not a quick let's start advocating. It has been a real intentional decision to be around other organizations that are prioritizing advocacy and learning along the way and finding what is a good fit. We found our Young Child Forum work at local district level to be really significant, and wonderful movements happening around the IDP and the municipal engagements. And the Equality Collective, Real Reform have been super supportive of that. It's a wonderful story of partnership. Regardless of the outcome, we're seeing benefits, knock-on benefits within our areas, even if it is a long game. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's such a stunning example of, if it was just Real Reform doing it on its own, or if it was just the Equality Collective doing it on its own, it would ultimately be isolated. Part of impactful advocacy is building power, and how change happens is building power through coalitions, through us all embedding this idea of what active citizenry means, and layering it kind of on our work, or over our work. And yes, advocacy can also be slow and unpredictable, but it can also be like extremely powerful, and you can see major policy shifts happening. And that's only because of sustained civil society pressure, or most often because of sustained civil society pressure, that you see major policy shifts. And that's what we need in ECD. So if we leave advocacy off the table, we're not going to get the shifts that we need,
So coming into this interview, there was a word that was fueling me that I had to drop into your court here to find out what it is that you have for us just to kind of discuss today, is around accountability, because I think the word is accountability. And I'll just let that simmer for a minute, because we've seen highs and lows when it comes to the government being held accountable and then not being held accountable. Or we're seeing this flow happen. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on where the sector is in terms of accountability. You've made mention of the budget speech. So on the budget, I guess that's one space. But maybe there's some other examples of accountability.
Yeah, I think it's how to build an accountable and responsive governance, and I really do strongly believe that that's only possible when you have a strong active citizenry, people who are showing up in government forums, asking questions, reading the documents, asking hard questions, pushing, and this almost relentless showing up. And it doesn't have to be adversarial, it can be super constructive, very helpful, relational, building relationships, building trust, building rapport. But that is ultimately, in my view, what builds strong and accountable governance. Obviously, there are other things like, independent journalism, independent courts, checks and balances, but equally necessary is a strong and active citizenry. And I think that's part of our work. There are other pieces to how we build accountability. But I think if you just had courts and you just just had journalists. You would lose something at the grassroots level. Journalists and courts can't get into every community. They can't get into, there are over 250 municipalities. They can't get into every municipality. And so we've got to do it as citizens. And we've got to figure out how to do that at scale. And that's in partnership through coalitions and getting ECD practitioners onboarded and engaged and involved, because we can't be in every IDP engagement meeting, it's just not possible.
I mean, the energy and the effort that goes into starting that kind of movement in many ways is like that domino effect. But I think once it gets going, it's that spark that really does start a lot more than just one or two meetings. Now we're talking about a movement, which is really encouraging in the sector. And I think the transition for ECD from Department of Social Development to the Department of Basic Education has been a major shift, because it's allowed the advocacy agenda to be very directed, and for us to use the shift as an opportunity to say we're starting fresh. And it's not even that fresh, because this has happened now. It's not, we're not happen today, but it's using the shift to almost like pivot and say, now is the time to get this right. We didn't get this right before. How do we get this right? What do you think are the other kind of enabling factors that this shift has encouraged?
I think a shift like this always, we were always cautiously optimistic. I think that was the phrasing we used at the beginning. But I think in hindsight, what I didn't realize is what a shift does in energy and in focus. So you had, ECD that was just part of DSD's portfolio and but what a migration does is it puts everyone's attention on, okay, well, what's our plan? What's our strategy? How are we going to fund this? And there's suddenly a lot of good people kind of thinking about this, strategizing about it, focusing on it. And otherwise, that wasn't really the case. No one was really thinking that strongly about what ECD could look like, or how could it be different, or how can we do it better? There's also like this competitive piece almost. So DMB, we've got to do this better than DSD did it. In some ways, I don't think I realized that. That there was like an energy in the shift that was going to happen. And yes, there's have been growing pains. And I think the DB, especially at the provincial level, has not been prepared in many ways for the shift. And there's been difficulties at the local level. But I think that there's still good energy there that is being captured. There's stronger trust. The DBE also has a universality mindset. They've done this. They've done it in basic education. They know what it means to reach all children. And so I think that's a mindset that also is good for the ECD space. Of course, they're still operating in a schooling mandate, and there are difficulties around what coordination should look like. And the DBE is not used to coordinating, whether the Department of Health is looking after the 0 to 2s and whether DSD is doing what they need to do. And so there's a lot of growing pains that need to happen a lot in the coordination space. But I still think good, positive energy, and we've seen it in the law reform space, we've seen it hopefully in the funding space, if we can keep that money. It's been I think a good move overall. How
do you deal with the disappointments that come with the advocacy journey? Here's an off-script question for you. Yeah.
I think when you're in the advocacy space, I think you have to know that things are going to be slow, unpredictable, and they're going to be disappointments. I don't think the reason, when we talk about advocacy being a long-term systemic option for change, you have to understand that there are going to be vicissitudes, ups and downs. But I think you've got to be really deliberate about finding joy in the work, and trusting that no one understands the failures of the system on the ground and those working on the ground. And so that's why we work with grassroots communities, and that we know that we're taking a long view and what does it mean to build power of the longer game. And how do we even just a narrative shift. So yes, we might lose funding in this budget because it's a budget moment that's very difficult and we don't know where the funding's going. But what about next year? You promised us this money this year. What about next year? So I think how you frame the losses is also like crucial, right? In terms of how can we reframe this or put in a narrative that doesn't lose hope? Because for me, hope is such a critical part of advocacy. And there are people who advocate in really negative spaces that break down our sense of community, idealism, collectivism. And that's not the kind of advocacy we're about. We're an advocacy organization that's committed to the constitutional values and visions of in South Africa. And so hope is such a critical part of that. And I think, take time, take stock, take a breath. Grieve if you need to grieve, but then we come back and we find hope somewhere, somehow.
Sure. This is the good stuff, man. This is why you podcast, is to hear the good things, the things that matter, because I think it is a hard question. You speak about funding, and funders often can easily gravitate towards impact projects, kind of programmatic work, and it's a real conversation around advocacy and what that looks like from a program's outcome perspective, and how do you measure advocacy if it's like go slow to go fast, how does that look, and how can you reap the reward of your investment, because ultimately that's what the investors are looking for. It may not be financial return, but what is the return? So I guess I have this question around how do we encourage more funding into advocacy work, particularly ECD advocacy work. And perhaps you could also put the lens of corporates and philanthropists into this picture, because we speak about government funding, and I think that is a significant mechanism. There are also other mechanisms that we can tap into. And so, if I raise all of those points in one go, because I think it's a big kettle of fish to open up.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. I mean, I think a lot of funders are scared of advocacy because they can perceive it as antagonistic, for instance. They don't think of it as empowering or anti-government, as opposed to building a capable state. And so there's a narrative shift that I think needs to happen and around how funders approach and perceive advocacy. I think some funders get systemic reform. They get that, but they don't necessarily see how advocacy is an investment in long-term systemic impact. And I think there's a shift there that needs to happen around being able to take the long lens, and also causation. It's very, very hard for us to say as real reform, we are the reason the budget increased, from 4 billion to 14 billion, whatever. It's hard for us to claim real gains. It's much easier to say, I fed this many children and they, this many children got through grade R. And so being a little bit flexible on what the causative indicators are in advocacy, I think is also essential. And I will say to funders, don't shift completely to advocacy. Recognize how important it is to build active citizenry, responsive and accountable government as an important piece of your puzzle. But service delivery is still absolutely important. So you need a balance. We need to make sure that providers are getting the support that they need. And so don't abandon that kind of strategy, but don't ignore advocacy either, because I think a lot of the barriers that you face if you lift your head up and look at the woods for the trees, your barriers can often be solved through advocacy. And so making sure that you have, and I'm not talking about one advocacy organization, I'm talking about proper coalitions that build power across multiple organizations and embed that at the grassroots level. So sustainable advocacy, that's the thing I think funders should be looking at supporting. So support movements, building power, investing leadership and capacity, have that dual strategy of service delivery and advocacy, I think is really, I think it's inspiring for funders to support that kind of work, because I think that's what's going to ultimately lead to the change that we want to see over the longer term.
Yeah, I guess it's that conversation around systems change. Are you up for the systems change, or and what is your appetite for that? So it's definitely a conversation we have in different ways with different partners, and it's been lovely to watch within the Real Reform specifically as a reference, very different organizations coming together with their mandate to advocate and then agreeing to work together. I guess there's like a story around the collective there. There's a story around partnership and that's not an easy outcome, but it's an amazing outcome. That alone, just that like working group, it's really interesting. And I guess I also want to highlight the time it takes and the energy and the effort to hold something like that together. Being that coordinator role is no joke.
Yeah, and it's critical. I think you absolutely, when you do this kind of work, the coordinator role, often people under support, and they kind of get someone who hasn't been embedded in the work or not really. They think it's like a secretary, whereas actually the coordinator is like the inspiration, the passion, the kind of the organizer. They need to be They need to be able to build relationships. They need to be able to build trust, right? Consensus, collaboration, all of these things. We need to make everyone feel safe, make people feel like they can participate fully and bring the fullness of themselves to the work, to the, to the shared vision and all of that. So that kind of coordinating function is so, so crucial to properly conceptualize and resource if you really want to do this work properly. Yeah.
I mean, pumped, right? These are awesome things. It's like when these things function. Yeah, it's like when these things function together, then advocacy.
Then you get in the trenches.
Yeah, this is the trenches. Exactly. And such an incredible journey to watch you grow in that space. My last question, kind of coming in for a landing here, is looking ahead. If you could see one major breakthrough, we're in the trenches. We're going for it with these amazing collaborative coalitions. Bravo to South Africa for getting behind that and the sector. If you could see one breakthrough in the next 5 years, what would it be, and what do you think we need to do to make that happen?
Well, if we get the money, I think we can all retire. Yeah. I'm telling you now, if we get that budget, we can retire. That's the big breakthrough, right? Universal public funding. Then we can worry about how do we spend that money? Like, do we have are the systems there in order to do that, etc. But let's get the money. Yeah. Okay, so I think public funding, obviously essential. State duties, clear state duties, obligations to make sure that we have universal access. And then quality, we can't leave quality conversations out of just universal access. We need to make sure that quality conversations are happening all along. That's not one, that's three. Sorry, Jess.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, you have the unlimited budget here, so awesome. Let's do it. I think what is so relevant to say is, the celebration that was held around the National Integrated ECD policy in 2015 was the first moment that the sector had something tangible that was legislative, that we could say, we have something, this is out. Now, fast forward a decade, we're in this space where we're like, we need money because it's not enough to just say the ideal exists. And that's really exciting to me to be working towards. Practically, what does that look like? Like, this is not just about a concept anymore. So, inspiring to be in the trenches with you. I love it. So I have my closeout game for you is, what song are we bringing to the bus when we're in the trenches? The disappointments have hit. What are we playing on the Spotify?
Am I allowed to play it, or do you want me to sing it?
Yeah, sing it. Come on, I'll join you.
Oh my word. But I don't think you know it.
Okay, teach me.
Okay. It's Days Like This by Van Morrison. Do you know it?
Okay. I mean, no, lead the way.
When it's not always raining, there'll be days like this. When there's no one complaining, there'll be days like this. When everything falls into place like the flick of a switch. While my mama told me there'll be days like this.
Love it.
Do I have to sing more?
What a way. No, no, it's fine. It was really just for the jam. For some reason, I backed you for more of like a hip hop, like.
Oh really? This song is like my absolute. Yeah, amazing. It just fits my soul, because even though you might be sitting with a bad day, you know that there are good days ahead, and that song reminds you that there are gonna be days when they're when it's not always raining.
Well, thank you for having fun with me, for daring to sing on YouTube.
It's a pleasure.
But also for really like boldly and courageously standing in a space as a young leader in the sector. Like, just so awesome. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us, and looking forward to the rest of the year of advocacy and beyond.
Yeah, and thanks for the critical partnership, and obviously an absolute privilege to be in the trenches with you. So thank you, Jess.
Amazing.
And the Dual Foundation.
Yeah, and to our listeners, I hope this was inspiring. I hope you laughed along with us, and I really felt those points around what it looks like to feel the disappointment, but also the high victories that come with very real issues. And if this isn't a call to action to get involved, I don't know what is. So, join us again.
Playtime.